You know, when you think of ancient Egypt, your mind probably jumps to towering pyramids, golden treasures, and these all-powerful pharaohs, right? But what happens when all that power just crumbles? Today, we're diving into a time of chaos and mystery, a period so murky it's often called a lost dynasty.
And that question, it feels super modern, doesn't it? But it's exactly what Egypt was facing more than 4,000 years ago. When central authority just vanishes, who steps in to fill that void? Well, that's really the heart of our story today.
Okay, so for centuries, the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom had it all. They built the Great Pyramids and had absolute power. And then, boom, around 2160 BCE, the whole system just falls apart. This collapse, which we now call the First Intermediate Period, created this massive power vacuum. And that's what set the stage for the Ninth Dynasty to emerge from all that chaos. So the big question is, how do you even study a dynasty that left behind no pyramids, no grand monuments, nothing like that? Well, it turns into a real historical detective story. We literally have to piece it together from the little fragments they left behind. And get this, our first clue is a lack of clues. The records from this time are incredibly sparse. Inscriptions are broken, and the king lists that survived, they all seem to contradict each other. But that silence, it actually speaks volumes. It tells you this was an era without a strong central government to write one single official history. Instead, you had all these local and often pretty fragile stories being recorded. All right, so for clue number 2, we shift from what's missing to what's actually there. Instead of those giant pyramids, we start finding smaller, local tombs and these carved stone slabs called stelae. Now, these weren't built by some all-powerful pharaoh. They were put up by regional governors, basically making their own statements of power, just on a much more local, personal scale. And our third clue, it might be the smallest, but honestly, it could be the most important. We're talking about these tiny administrative seals. They were used to stamp official documents and goods, and what they prove is that even without a grand pharaoh on the throne, some kind of bureaucracy was still at work. Local offices were still open, and the basic machinery of government was still chugging along. So who were these people? Who were the ones trying to hold everything together? Let's meet the main players in this mystery, the shadowy kings of the Ninth Dynasty, who ruled out of a city called Herakleopolis. We've got a few names that pop up, like Meribre Keti and Wahkare Keti, but they come from those same jumbled, fragmented lists. And these guys were not pharaohs in the classic sense. You should think of them more like regional kings, ruling from their northern stronghold, with power that was pretty limited and was constantly being challenged. And that's the key right there, competition, because they were not alone. While the Ninth Dynasty was trying to control the north of Egypt, a brand new power was on the rise in the south. This set the stage for a kingdom literally divided against itself. So what you have here is basically a tale of two powers, both vying for control of the Nile. Up in the north, you've got the Herakleopolitan kings, and they're really just focused on holding their territory together, just surviving. But down south, a new line of ambitious rulers in Thebes, who would become the 11th dynasty, was getting stronger and stronger. And they had a much bigger goal, to reunite all of Egypt under their command. There's a line from our source material that just captures this period so perfectly. Borders moved like sand. I mean, just picture that. There was no stable frontier. Power and territory just shifted constantly.
Yeah, this rivalry wasn't like one big, single war. You should think of it more as this long, simmering conflict. It was a whole series of skirmishes and battles fought over decades, with bits of territory along the Nile changing hands again and again. It was just a constant struggle for survival on one side and dominance on the other.
Which leads to a pretty obvious question, right? How on earth did the Ninth Dynasty manage to rule at all in this fractured land? Well, it turns out they developed this really clever and pragmatic strategy, not for glory, but for simple survival. Their strategy really had 3 core parts. First, build local. Forget the giant pyramids. They focused on projects that would solidify their immediate power base. Second, empower the locals. Instead of trying to replace all the regional governors or nomarchs, they just worked with them. And third, and this is crucial, they kept the economy flowing. They focused on the essentials, like making sure agriculture and trade could continue. So at the end of the day, their power wasn't coming from some grand claim of divine rights shouted from a massive throne. No, it was built on something much more practical. The ability to just keep the gears of society turning, to make sure local offices worked and the grain kept moving.
This was governance at its most basic, most essential level.
Okay, so we've pieced together all these clues, all these shards of history. What's the final verdict on this so-called lost dynasty? What does it all really mean? The story of the Ninth Dynasty is just such a great reminder that our view of the past is always a work in progress. We're basically historians acting like archaeologists, slowly and carefully trying to reconstruct a picture from whatever scattered shards time decided to leave behind for us. It's a history that's defined by uncertainty. But you know what? That's what makes it so fascinating to uncover. And this leaves us with one last really big thought. The Ninth Dynasty wasn't necessarily less important than the Great Pyramid builders. They just left a completely different kind of mark. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Is history really the story of what happened? Or is it just the story of what was built to last?